Long before borders were drawn on maps, the northern frontier of Mexico lived in fear of riders no wall could stop. They were the Comanche, masters of the horse, born to the wind and raised beneath an endless sky. To the settlers of northern Mexico, these warriors seemed to appear from nowhere and vanish the same way. At dawn, a ranch could be whole. By noon, its corrals empty, its smoke rising for reasons no one dared to chase. The Mexican soldiers sent north called this land La Frontera del Miedo, the frontier of fear. Their maps showed territory. The Comanche saw only grass, rivers, and sky. No lines, no nations. In a single generation, these riders had turned stolen Spanish horses into an empire that moved with the seasons. They raided not for gold or glory, but for survival. Horses, food, and captives to trade along the frontier. Each raid taught Mexico a hard lesson, that the open plains belonged to those swift enough to rule them. And soon, the richest province in Mexico would learn that lesson in blood and fire. Word spread through the settlements that a new Comanche warband was riding south toward the Rio Grande. Farmers abandoned their fields, driving cattle into stone corrals and loading wagons with whatever they could carry. At Fort Lipan, a handful of Mexican soldiers prepared for a raid they knew was coming but could not predict. They stacked ammunition, patched uniforms, and prayed the riders would pass them by this time. Before dawn the next morning, dogs began barking. A distant rumble answered from beyond the hills. Comanche riders came like a storm, their horses pounding the dry ground as arrows darkened the air. The first wave struck the outer walls, circling fast, shouting in the Comanche tongue to confuse the defenders. Inside, powder smoke filled every room, and the soldiers fought blind, firing at sound instead of sight. When the dust cleared, the riders had vanished, leaving behind only hoofprints and silence. To the survivors, it felt less like a victory than a warning. The frontier had just met its new master. As months passed, raids turned into campaigns, long rides that stretched deep into the heart of northern Mexico. Entire villages vanished overnight, their people taken or scattered, their supplies hauled north toward the plains. Each captured horse became a weapon, each captive a way to trade for guns and powder along the frontier markets. Through this trade, the Comanche built a power that stretched farther than any mapmaker dared to draw. Their raids reached as far as Durango and Chihuahua, crossing deserts that had defeated armies and settlers alike. Mexican governors offered silver for peace, but the warriors of the plains understood no treaty that fixed boundaries. To the Comanche, land was life itself, open and endless, meant to be ridden, not fenced or claimed. Every season brought new movement, camps shifting with rivers, herds, and storms across thousands of miles. They called this vast country Comancheria, a domain ruled not by walls, but by speed and fearlessness. Even foreign powers began to mark their maps with that name, proof that an empire on horseback truly existed. By the mid-1840s, the Mexican frontier was burning, and governors demanded retribution for every lost town and ranch. Columns of cavalry formed in dusty plazas, their orders clear: ride north, find the Comanche, and make them pay. The campaign began with hope, but the soldiers soon discovered the plains offered no roads, no water, and no mercy. Within days, their horses weakened, and dust storms erased the very trails they followed. Comanche scouts watched from ridgelines, silent as hawks, counting every man and every musket. At dusk, the first attack came, not from ahead but from every direction at once. Mexican soldiers fired blindly into the dark, hitting only the night in their own fear. When dawn came, dozens of horses were gone, and the Comanche had vanished again into the endless land. Survivors limped south, their boots worn through, their rifles empty, their silence heavier than any defeat. Behind them, the plains returned to quiet, the domain of the riders who answered to no flag on earth. When Mexico lost the north to the United States, a new power entered the plains, one even the Comanche had never faced. The Texans came with rifles that fired faster, wagons that carried farther, and a hunger for land that knew no limit. To the Comanche, these newcomers were not soldiers but entire families, harder to fight, impossible to chase away. At first, raids continued, fast strikes at night that left settlers terrified and forts on constant alert. But each year, the rifles grew stronger, and the iron roads began to cut through the plains. Fort after fort appeared, wooden walls, signal towers, and telegraph wires, reaching where once only riders travelled. The Comanche answered with fire, striking at outposts, herds, and stage routes that crossed their hunting grounds. But now, they faced armies that never stopped coming. Soldiers, settlers, surveyors, all marching west behind flags and steel. Even as victories faded, the Comanche rode with the same defiance. Each battle fought to remind the plains who they were. But the frontier was changing faster than any horse could outrun, and even the lords of the plains could feel it closing in. By the 1860s, the open plains that once fed millions of buffalo had begun to fall silent. Herds that once stretched beyond the horizon were hunted to near extinction by settlers and traders. Without the buffalo, the Comanche lost more than food. They lost the rhythm that had shaped their entire world. Then came disease, carried by travellers, spreading faster than any horse could ride. Villages emptied overnight, leaving silent lodges and abandoned fires to smoulder beneath the stars. Meanwhile, US forts multiplied across the plains, each one pushing the Comanche further from their hunting grounds. In 1874, the army launched its final campaign, the Red River War, determined to end Comanche freedom forever. They fought through canyons and dry riverbeds, holding on until the last horse fell and the last campfire died. By winter, the survivors surrendered, proud riders now walking beside soldiers toward the reservation gates. The lords of the plains had fallen, not by a single battle, but by a world that refused to stop closing in. On the reservations of Oklahoma, the last Comanche horsemen tried to rebuild a life from memories and dust. They taught their children the old words, the songs of the buffalo hunts, and the names of every river they once crossed. Though the horses were fewer, the spirit of the riders endured, carried now through stories instead of war cries. In the early 1900s, Comanche scouts once again rode with the US cavalry, this time as allies, not enemies. Their knowledge of the plains guided armies. Their language later helped code messages in distant wars. Back home, families held on to their dances, their crafts, and the sacred ceremonies of renewal each spring. Every generation found a new way to ride, not on horseback but through memory, language, and pride. In museums and archives, their stories rest beside the rifles and saddles that once defined their world. Yet outside those walls, the wind over the plains still carries the same whisper it did a century ago. It speaks of riders who once ruled the horizon, and of a people who never truly surrendered it. Today, the wind over Texas and Oklahoma still crosses the same trails once carved by hooves and fire. Every ridge, every dry river carries a trace of the riders who shaped two nations and changed them both forever. Their story is not just of conquest or loss, but of endurance, a people adapting yet refusing to disappear. From the sound of drums at sunset to the language still spoken in classrooms, their legacy rides on. Because history may change the borders, but the plains, and those who remember them, remain eternal.